Every roofer in Pickens County, South Carolina, looked at that tin the same way. Creased down the center, oil-stained on one side, bent at angles that made it useless for any building that intended to stand upright. The foreman at the Greenville sheet metal mill called it coal stock. The drivers who hauled it to the dump site behind the old dairy barn on Route 135 called it worse than that. For 13 years, from 1997 to 2010, every man who touched that tin agreed on one thing. It was waste. And they were all wrong. Stories like this don't get told much anymore. If you grew up around people who worked with their hands and didn't say much about it, hit subscribe. We're going to keep telling them as long as you keep watching. The mill was Greenville Pressed Metal, a mid-size operation on the south end of town that stamped corrugated roofing panels and ridge caps for agricultural supply houses across the upstate. They ran 3 shifts on a good month, 2 when orders slowed. The press line was a 1979 Bradbury roll former that could stamp 26-gauge galvanized sheets at about 40 panels an hour when it was running clean. It ran clean maybe 60% of the time. When the rollers drifted out of tolerance, which happened every second or third run depending on humidity and the age of the bearings, the panels came out with a bow in the center rib, sometimes a 1/4 inch, sometimes more. You couldn't sell a bowed panel. The agricultural dealers wouldn't take them. Didn't matter if the galvanization was perfect. Didn't matter if the gauge was right. One crease in the wrong place, and the whole sheet was scrap. So the rejected panels went into a wire-bound pallet, and every Thursday a flatbed from Darnell Hauling ran them out to a dump site off Route 135, where a man named Grady Finch owned 40 acres of bottomland that wasn't good for much besides storing things people no longer wanted. Grady charged the mill $75 a load. Had been doing it since the Reagan administration. Nobody questioned it. He stacked the pallets behind the dairy barn in rows 12 deep and didn't think about them again. By 2003, there were over 400 pallets back there, rusting in the rain like some forgotten library of metal nobody had bothered to check out. The woman who changed that was named Delia Flood. She was 31 in 2004 when she first drove past Grady's place on her way to a job site in Easley. She wasn't a roofer yet. Not exactly. She worked for a company called Ridge Brothers Exteriors out of Anderson County, running their crew scheduling and answering their phones and doing the kind of work that keeps a contracting outfit alive without ever getting credit for it. She had no contracting license. She had no capital beyond what Ridge Brothers paid her, which was $11, $50 an hour, with no benefits and no mileage. What she had was a notebook. And what was in that notebook came from a man who had been dead 6 years. His name was Emmett Flood. He was Delia's grandfather on her mother's side, and he had roofed barns and chicken houses and packed sheds across Oconee and Pickens counties for 42 years. Starting in 1953, when a galvanized panel cost 11 cents a square foot, and you could roof a 40 by 60 tobacco barn for under $200 in materials. Emmett was not a big talker. He went to church on Sundays and the co-op on Tuesdays, and he didn't go much of anywhere else. What he did was keep a ledger, a small green one, the kind you could buy at the Farmers Exchange in Walhalla for 90 cents, and in it he recorded every job he ever did. Not just the price and the customer name. The pitch of the roof, the exposure direction, which side took the afternoon sun, which side faced the prevailing wind, the gauge and brand of the tin, the fastener pattern, and most importantly, how each panel weathered over time. He'd go back to jobs 5, 10, 20 years later and write down which panels had rusted through, which had held, and what he thought explained the difference. He noted the drainage angle. He noted the overlap. He noted where the water sat after a hard rain and how long it took to dry. Nobody paid him to do this. No one asked. He just did it because he thought it mattered, and because he was the kind of man who believed that paying attention was a form of respect for the work. Delia's mother said Emmett filled 11 of those green ledgers between 1953 and 1996, when his hands got too stiff to write small. Delia found the last one in a toolbox in his shop after he died in 1998. She was 25. She'd never roofed anything in her life. She couldn't read most of his shorthand. He had his own symbols for pitch ratios, his own abbreviations for panel types, his own way of marking a roof that was failing versus one that was sound. But she kept the ledger because it was his, and over the next 6 years, working that phone desk at Ridge Brothers, she taught herself to read it the way a person teaches themselves a second language. Slowly, one phrase at a time. Cross-referencing his notes against roofs she could still go look at on weekends in Oconee County, driving the back roads in her Corolla with the ledger open on the passenger seat. What Emmett figured out over 4 decades was something the supply houses and manufacturers never talked about because it didn't help them sell new product. He figured out that bent tin, panels with a slight crown or bow from a press defect, actually shed water faster than flat-stamped panels when installed on low-pitch roofs. The bow created a natural channel down the center rib. Rain didn't pool, it moved. And the panels that moved water fastest lasted longest, because standing water is what eats galvanized steel, not the rain itself, the sitting. He wrote it down in the green ledger in a line that Delia eventually decoded. It read, in Emmett's hand, Crone panel 212 pitch outruns flat 3X drain. 14-year no rust Dale Whitfield barn Oconee 1971 job. By the time she drove past Grady Finch's place in the fall of 2004 and saw those pallets of rejected tin stacked behind the dairy barn, she understood exactly what she was looking at. She pulled over on the shoulder of Route 135 and just sat there for a while with the engine running, looking through the fence. She could see the bow in the panels from 50 yards. She could see the way they were stacked, the creased ones leaning against the straight ones, the whole pile written off and forgotten. 400 pallets of roofing material that performed better on low-pitch agricultural buildings than the panels people were paying full price for at the supply house in Seneca. She didn't tell anybody. She didn't talk about it at work. She didn't mention it to Ray, her cousin, who would have asked too many questions and then told someone at the gas station. She just drove home and sat at her kitchen table with the ledger open and a calculator from the Dollar General and did the math until it was dark outside. She pulled into Grady's Drive on a Tuesday. October 12th. He was sitting on the porch sorting through a box of electrical fittings he'd bought at a church auction in Dacusville. There was a dog under his chair that didn't get up, and a glass of tea on the rail that was mostly ice. He looked at her like she was lost. She asked him what he planned to do with the tin. Grady said he planned to keep charging the mill $75 a load to haul it until one of them died. Delia asked if she could buy some. Grady looked at her for a long moment. He said she could have all she wanted for $40 a pallet, which was a number he invented on the spot because nobody had ever asked before, and he didn't see a reason to think too hard about it. She didn't negotiate. She didn't ask for a better price. She said she'd take 20 pallets. That was $800, which was most of what she had in her savings account, $1,040 to be exact. She wrote him a check that afternoon and asked if he had a pen because hers was out of ink. A man named Harlan Teague was leaning on the fence line between Grady's property and the Caldwell place when the whole exchange happened. Harlan had been running cattle on the Caldwell lease for 11 years and knew Grady the way neighbors in rural Pickens County know each other, which is to say they waved from their trucks and talked briefly at the co-op and never asked personal questions. Harlan said later he watched Delia back a borrowed trailer up to the first row of pallets and thought she was either starting a scrapyard or losing some kind of bet he didn't understand. He didn't say anything to her, just watched. Delia didn't have a contractor's license. She didn't have a crew. She didn't have a truck of her own. She borrowed Ray's 1994 Ford F-250 with a dented tailgate and a hitch that pulled slightly left. What she had was 20 pallets of bent 26-gauge galvanized tin, a dead man's notebook, and a plan she hadn't explained to anyone because she was fairly sure no one would understand it, and she didn't feel like arguing. She started small. Smaller than small. A chicken house roof in Westminster for a man named Dale Coggins, who had 60 laying hens and a leak over the nesting boxes that was ruining his egg count. Dale didn't care that the tin was bent. He cared that it was $0. 18 a square foot when the supply house in Seneca was charging $0. 79. Delia told him the panels would outlast flat-pressed tin on his roof pitch, which was about a 212 slope. Dale said he didn't particularly care about that either. He just wanted dry hens. She roofed it in 2 days with Ray and a kid named Marcus from her church who was 17 and needed summer work and didn't mind being on a roof in August. The total material cost was $94. She charged Dale $475 for labor and materials. Her profit after gas, after buying fasteners and butyl tape at the hardware store in Westminster, and after paying Marcus $60 for 2 days, was $309. Not much by any standard that matters to a bank. But it was hers. And the roof didn't leak. Not after the first rain, not after the second. Not after a November storm that blew a branch through Dale's carport and didn't touch the chicken house. Dale told his brother about the woman who'd roofed his hen house for less than $500. His brother had a hay barn that was leaking onto his round bales. He called Delia on a Wednesday. She went back to Grady and bought another 30 pallets. Then another 40. Then she asked him a question that changed the economics of everything. She asked him to stop charging the mill $75 a load to take the tin and instead let her pay him a flat $30 a pallet to divert it directly to a storage yard she was renting, a half-acre lot behind the old peach stand on Highway 11. Grady agreed because $30 a pallet for doing nothing was better than $75 a load for driving a flatbed. The mill agreed because free disposal beat paying Grady. Delia had just built herself a supply chain out of other people's arithmetic. By 2006, she had her contractor's license. Took the exam in Greenville on a Saturday and passed it the first time, which she said surprised her less than it should have. By 2007, she had a crew of 4. She was roofing barns, equipment sheds, and pole buildings across 3 counties using tin that every roofer in the upstate would have thrown away without a second look. Her material costs were not slightly lower than her competitors. They were a different category of number. She was buying panels for $30 to $40 a pallet, roughly 60 to 80 sheets per pallet, while her competitors were paying the supply house $0, 79 to $1. 10 per square foot for factory fresh corrugated. On a standard 40 by 60 pole barn, her material cost ran about $380. Her competitors ran closer to $2,200. She didn't undercut them by much on the bid price. That was the quiet part. She bid 10 to 15% below Ridge Brothers and the other outfits in the area, which was enough to win jobs, but not enough to make anyone ask questions. The margin she kept was wide and silent, and she kept going back to Grady's. The roofs held. That was what nobody expected. A chicken house she roofed in Pickens in 2005 was still dry in 2011 with no panel replacement. A cattle barn in 6 Mile she did in 2007 hadn't lost a single sheet by 2013. A 60-foot equipment shed in Central she roofed in 2008 got inspected by the building department for a property transfer in 2015. And the inspector wrote roof in excellent condition on the form without knowing the panels had been stamped wrong and thrown away by the mill that made them. Emmett's theory about crown panels shedding water on low-pitch agricultural roofs wasn't a guess. It was 42 years of observation written down in green ledgers by a man who never charged more than $400 for a job and never once thought that was a reason his work didn't matter. Delia never told her customers the tin was mill rejects. She didn't have to. She told them it was 26-gauge galvanized corrugated, which it was. She told them it would hold, which it did. She told them her grandfather had taught her how to read a roof, which was true in a way she didn't feel the need to explain further. Not dishonest, just private. By 2010, the mill retooled its press line with newer Bradbury equipment, and the volume of cull stock dropped by more than half. Delia had seen it coming. She'd already been stockpiling through 2008 and 2009. Buying every pallet Grady had. She had over 1,000 pallets stored in 3 locations, the half-acre on Highway 11, a leased lot behind the John Deere dealership in Liberty, and a fenced section of Grady's original property that he rented her for $200 a month. She'd spent roughly $38,000 on tin over 6 years. That tin was now the foundation of a roofing business, doing $92,000 a year in revenue with margins most contractors in the county would not have believed. She hired a woman named Patrice Dunlap in 2011 to handle the books and the phones. Patrice had been an office manager at a Purina feed mill outside Clemson that closed when the parent company consolidated. She didn't know anything about roofing. Delia said that was fine. She said Patrice knew how to answer a phone and make a person feel like their problem mattered, which was harder to teach than how to run a screw gun. By 2014, Flood Roofing had 6 employees, 2 trucks Delia owned outright, a 2008 F-350 and a 2011 Chevy 3500, and standing contracts with 3 farm management companies across the upstate. Revenue that year was $174,000. She had never taken out a business loan. She had never run a single advertisement. Every job came from referral or repeat. Harlan Teague, the neighbor who'd watched her load that first trailer at Grady's in 2004, hired her in 2015 to re-roof a hay barn on the Caldwell lease. While she was up on the ridge running a chalk line, he told her from the ground that he'd thought she was out of her mind a decade earlier. She called down that he was probably right. She didn't say it like a joke, more like she was admitting something she'd genuinely considered and hadn't entirely ruled out. The numbers by 2019 were hard to argue with, even for people inclined to argue. Flood Roofing had done $312,000 in gross revenue. Delia's crew was at 9, including Marcus, who was 29 now and running his own jobs under her license. She had expanded into standing seam metal roofing for residential work, buying those panels from a supplier in Spartanburg at full market price, the same way everyone else did. The agricultural side, the bent panel work, the cull stock from Greenville pressed metal, was still the core of her barn and shed business. But the stockpile was finite. She knew it would run out. She planned for it the way Emmett had planned for weather, slowly, on paper, without talking about it. In 2021, the price of rolled steel went up 47% in 6 months. Roofing contractors across the Southeast were scrambling to honor bids they'd written at old prices. A contractor in Lawrence County told a friend of Delia's he'd lost $11,000 on a single pole barn job because he'd quoted materials in January and bought them in April. Some of them ate the loss and kept working. Some of them walked away from signed contracts, which is a good way to make sure nobody ever calls you again. Delia had enough coal stock tin in her 3 storage yards to keep bidding agricultural jobs at her old margins for another 2 full years, while everyone around her was paying spot prices that turned profitable work into charity. A foreman at Ridge Brothers, the same company that had once paid her $11.50 an hour to answer their phones, told a supplier rep at a trade show in Greenville that Delia Flood was either subsidizing her bids with outside money or stealing tin from somewhere. He said it in a way that suggested he thought the second option was more likely. She was doing neither. She was spending material she'd bought for $30 a pallet in 2006 when everyone around her was paying 2021 prices for the same gauge metal. Nobody had stolen anything. Nobody had cheated. She had just paid attention before they did. She crossed $300,000 in net revenue for the first time in 2022. Not gross. Net. After payroll, after liability insurance, after fuel, after the $200 a month to Grady's daughter for storage rent, and after the $14,200 she spent that year replacing the transmission in the F-350 because she does not believe in truck payments. She did it without a line of credit, without a partner, and without ever once explaining to a competitor or a supplier where her tin came from. Grady Finch died in the spring of 2020 at 86. His daughter sold the 40 acres to a developer from Greenville who is building townhomes on it now. The dairy barn is gone. The spot where 400 pallets of bent tin, once rusted in rows, is a graded parking pad for a model unit with vinyl siding. Delia went to the funeral. She said Grady was the only person who ever sold her something without asking what she planned to do with it, and she always respected that about him. Emmett's green ledger, the last one, the one from the toolbox, is in a fireproof box in Delia's office in Easley. She is 49 now. She doesn't show the ledger to people. She says she ought to start keeping better records herself, the way he did, and the way she says it makes it clear she knows that was the whole point all along and she hasn't quite lived up to it. Harlan Teague still tells the story at the Co-op in Liberty. He says he watched a woman write an $800 check for a pile of junk tin that a mill was paying somebody else to throw away, and he thought it was the dumbest use of money he had seen in 30 years of farming. He tells it different now. He says it might have been the smartest. Some people look at what's bent and see the end of its usefulness. Some people look at what's bent and see where the water goes,